at that time, it wasn't incredibly specific, just what we would do. So I've been trying to think about what might be most useful. And I think what people are probably looking for is some sort of overall introduction to the ways in which Sahlins' work connects with David Graeber's. And so I've tried to pick out some parts that would be relevant. Sorry, I was delayed a little bit. I had to click on something about the recording and my mouse wouldn't move. So we're back to talking about just why we would want to look at Sahlins and how it connects with Graeber. And as I was looking through his work, obviously it goes back a very long time, something like 70 years. And the question is, what sort of connections would be most relevant? And I think that there are threads that go through, and there's a conversation between the two that isn't always recognized or flagged. It's kind of subtle, talking about similar topics, but diverging, citing the same writers. And what I think is we see a conversation over many decades, and there's some themes that we could look at. And I think that the ones maybe that people are most interested in and that are most relevant in terms of the dawn of everything discussion have to do with determinism and freedom, and with evolution and culture. And Sahlins has been a major contributor in those areas. So we can look at his particular points of view, partly as things that David Graeber would have been engaged with, but also as things that have been really important in the construction of anthropology throughout this period, because Sahlins is one of the leading figures in American anthropology. And he had a way throughout his entire career of picking what were really important questions in the field as a whole and making significant contributions to it. So he shaped the field of American anthropology in many ways. And I thought it would also be interesting to look at something that was very recent. And I think that kinship is something that's unavoidable when we start to look at how we want to reconstruct the worlds we're living in. So I did give this short quote in the blurb I offered. This then is what I take a kinship system to be: a manifold of intersubjective participations founded on mutuality of being. And I think that that is incredibly interesting. I think that what anthropology is really all about, and it connects with the discussion that we just finished, is the challenge of living in a world together with other people. And we're obviously not finding that a very easy thing to do. So it asks sort of fundamental basic science questions about how we would go about doing that, and then trying to do that with respect for other people and other people's freedom and our own. So that's what I find most interesting, the way in which he's shifting the discussion of kinship into one that's primarily about mutuality. And it's not as if he's the first person to do that. He refers back to Durkheim, and Mauss is relevant there too. But it's not the way in which it's usually talked about in anthropology. So I think that this is particularly useful to do. And I think that it resonates with the end of toward an anthropological theory of value very strongly. And you can see there are ways in which Sahlins and David Graeber are talking about the same thing, but also talking about it very differently. And I think that perhaps that's interesting because on the one hand, we can engage with David Graeber's ideas in this way, and then we can also have our sense of them sharpened by being able to see what they aren't. So in the same way in which in reading The Dawn of Everything, or the way in which it's constructed itself, in opposition to some other ideas, we can look at the ideas of mutuality in Graeber's work by contrasting them with what Sahlins is doing. Let's see. just at the very end of Toward an Anthropological Theory of Value, David Graeber wrote, what makes creativity so confusing to both actor and analyst is the fact that these powers are precisely so fundamentally social. They are social both because they are the result of an ongoing process whereby structures of relation with others come to be internalized into the very fabric of our being, and even more because this potential cannot realize itself, at least not in any particularly significant way, except in coordination with others. It is only thus that powers turn into value. And that foresees or assumes the way in which they're embedded in every aspect of our daily life. And the way in which David Graeber has especially contributed to this so far is in looking at political structures and economic structures. And there are very good reasons for making those choices. What Sahlins is contributing in these particular articles is he wants to look at it in terms of kinship. And to some extent, in one of his earlier works, Culture and Practical Reason, he tries to argue that, well, the Western world is focused overwhelmingly on economics, but the rest of the world is focused more on kinship. And that is, I think, not exactly so, but it does represent how some people want to look at things. So we can sort of see that to some extent what Sahlins is saying is that there are areas that escape our understanding if we look at everything through a Western lens that is very heavily economic. And we can hold that idea in our minds, I think, while not necessarily saying that there's such a inescapable or divide. And I might say, just to situate myself, since I haven't met any of you in person and I've just been here in this reading group for so long, I'm really delighted to be part of it, but I probably come out of a slightly different experience, which is a lifelong practice of ethnography and a concern because of, although I was very young in 1968, it did change my life. And it, as a child of that, I wanted to understand how we transform the world we live in. And when I went to try to explore some of that ethnographically, looking at what it's like in people's real lives and trying to understand things like the dissolution of collectives. I went to China when I was 23 and I've stayed engaged with it. So it's, in a sense, how do people do these incredible transformations one after another in their lives? And I spent a lot of time looking at things like political economy and cultural representations. It started off in the Cultural Revolution era. And what I found when I got into villages and looked at what people were doing in their everyday life, all of these changes in political economy got expressed through families, households, and communities. And as they were rebuilding their lives through all of these things that everybody else was reading through policy statements, they became real in lives that were lived in many ways in terms of how they were related to their neighbors and to their relatives. So it was expressed very heavily in terms of kinship. So it's left me with a sense that if we understand fundamental transformation in people's lives, we do have to look at how they relate to the people closest to them. And very often this takes the form of kinship. So that's probably one reason why I read this kind of literature, although I don't read with some highly technical stuff like kinship terminology and so on that puts me to sleep too. But basically there's a sense in which what we need to understand is how people relate to other people and share their essence, their everyday life, everything that matters to them with the people who are closest to them. And if you want to remake the world, you're remaking those immediate relationships. And I think that this is part of what Sahlins is getting at, although he pulls back from it in certain ways too and makes it very abstract. And I'm not going to spend all my time talking, but I as I looked at these texts in preparing, I thought some of them were very dense and very anthropological. And so I'm going to give a little bit of context for why Sahlins is formulating it this way, in ways that also are very important in our shared culture now. And make certain that I don't talk so long we don't get a time to talk about it. But first of all, maybe I should say that kinship is definitely not biology. And there's no known kinship system, no known human kinship system that coincides with biology. And we can discuss that if people want to challenge that, but it really doesn't, nobody can find one because they don't exist. And we can think, for example, about how we bring people into our kinship systems through adoption and fostering, and we can think of all the people that we don't bother to think about, like our remote cousins and so on. So those are the obvious ones, but there are all kinds of other ways in which we construct our kinship systems based on who we are closest to, not on who we think we're biologically related to. And it's still the case that a lot of the time we may talk about kinship as if it's biology. One of the things that American cultural anthropology responds to and is shaped by is David Schneider's idea that we use shared substance. In talking about American kinship, that Americans use shared substance as a pervasive metaphor for talking about kinship. So it's just metaphorical, it's a cultural construction, but it's a very powerful one because it makes us feel very close in the way in which we naturalize our relations with each other. Basically, this has been very influential. Sahlins wants to avoid going quite that far. He thinks that there's something he wants to talk about that's called kinship that isn't entirely arbitrary in that way. And he's looking for a way to be not quite so arbitrary. And he argues that people choose relationships, but not not necessarily that they can choose relationships, but not exactly how they're going to be practiced. So he's trying to get us to think in a fundamentally different way about kinship. And that goes to the concept of culture, which is the place that is defining here. I'm not American, by the way, or trained in the United States, but you can't avoid American cultural anthropology, really. So that is, that concept of culture is absolutely essential. So I think it's probably useful to find a minute or two here to talk about that, because it's key to the determinism that David Graeber tries to oppose. So it's unquestionable that as human beings, as a species, we have this capacity to symbolize. And a lot of anthropology is preoccupied with thinking about how we manage to reflect upon, communicate, talk about with other people about the world that we're living in and about each other and everything around us. At the same time, sociality is also a specific human form to our species, and how are these things connected is one of the issues that they're getting at. American cultural anthropology has chosen to focus itself overwhelmingly on the concept of culture. And it's not obvious that that would be the case. In Britain, for example, we have social anthropology predominantly, which is comparative sociology in a sense. The particular issue about culture is partly a preoccupation with this feature that seems in some way unique to human beings. And there's certainly been efforts to find whether other species have culture, and I don't think we need to worry if it turns out that they do. It's still central to being human. Sahlins takes a particular view of his critique of culture, which goes only part of the distance that I think David Graeber goes. And what Sahlins does is look at what he thinks is a very Parsonian view that was predominant in American anthropology in the mid and late 20th century. And what Talcott Parsons, who was a leading theorist in the social sciences, he was primarily a sociologist, but he theorized everything and really was very hegemonic. He argued that there were three fields that we could look at. We could look at how our minds work, we could look at our social worlds, and we could look at our symbolic existence. And he separated these into being the realms of psychology, sociology, and anthropology. And anthropology in the American tradition came to focus itself overwhelmingly on the study of culture. And some of what Parsons was saying was that these are different levels of existence, and you cannot explain any one of them in terms of the other. They each have their own internal modes of operating, and we have to look at them separately. And there's a problem there. And Sahlins is quite concerned that what this seemed to do was to take culture out of its social existence. So that whereas we actually are thinking about and conceptualizing everything that humans think about and conceptualize through our social relations with other people, arbitrarily taking this out of our social life is a terrible mistake. So his argument in the articles that we've been reading and elsewhere is that that simply made the mistake of taking culture out of social relations. And therefore what he's wanting to do is to, in a sense, put it back into our social world. And it's probably broadly agreed in anthropology at any rate that the human adaptation is one that's very largely about sociality. You know, we're individually so fragile, we have to share our being and everything about our lives with the people closest to us, around us, with wider ties as well. The particular way in which humans are social is a feature of our species, and it's inescapable because if we didn't make sociality work, we wouldn't survive. So it is absolutely essential and rooted in ourselves. It doesn't mean that we're hardwired for very specific ways of being social, but that we have to have this capacity for sociality. So what he wants to do in terms of talking about mutuality here is to put it, the ways in which we're connected with other people at the center of our symbolic meaning and our social meaning, and push it way back in a way that is central, but also completely social. And this is where the mutuality of being comes in. So it is so deeply shared, and you cannot think of it separate from the relations and the activities we have together with other people. And that, I think, is the particular strength of it, and the thing that David Graeber picks up on and makes an assumption about, and that we want to think about. There's also this other sense in which there is an enormous weight that Sahlins then continues to place upon culture. And this, I think, is where some things get to be a little bit difficult, and we have to look at Sahlins and David Graeber going in very different directions. Sahlins has an idea of culture as being deeply embedded in ourselves and not entirely conscious, and in many ways still outside of ourselves, so that we get inculcated into a particular culture and we're not necessarily fully aware of it. he sees some of it as beyond our ability to control. And that is a question we probably do want to raise. We can't assume, it would be an act of extraordinary hubris to assume that we are fully self-aware all the time of what we are thinking or how we came to be able to think of it, because some of it gets imbued in us so early in life from the people around us. It's social, but we may not have as much access to it as we like to think. And this is sort of one of the questions that we want to think about. It's very hard to solve. And one of the things about Sahlins that makes him a little bit extreme is that he was a student of Leslie White, who's somebody people may not have heard of, but he was a very important theorist in the middle part of the 20th century. And here we're going to get to some of the things that come up in the dawn of everything. Leslie White was a very prominent mid-20th century theorist who talked about culture in an evolutionary context. And he had a couple very important books on this subject that influenced a vast number of people at this time, including Sahlins. One was The Evolution of Culture, which is something people might want to look at if they want to engage in further critiques of the popularizations that David Graeber was responding to. And it set the pattern for how a lot of people thought about culture. And then he had a particular view that he saw all of this as a cultural process. And he took a rather extreme point of view on that, all of which is expressed in one of his key articles. And it's right there in the title: Man's Control Over Civilization, an Anthropocentric Illusion. And basically, he thought that culture evolved, and that people shouldn't, we've just fooled ourselves to think that we're in some sort of control over this. And it's basically moving the argument about evolution from biology into culture, and it seems very human, but it's also placed very much outside ourselves, so that we are captured within the processes by which culture is deciding to evolve. And it is very largely those problems of scale that David Graeber and David Wengrow criticize so much. So this is very much at the heart of what was going on in cultural anthropology. Sahlins was Leslie White's student, and together with Elman Service, who was a student of Julian Stewart, who was a founding figure in cultural ecology, got together to write a study called Evolution and Culture, which talked about general and specific evolution, and tried to bring together those perspectives about evolution and ecological adaptation. In that context, they argued that there was a general process of evolution that could be talked about in Leslie White's center, but the people did it specifically in their own way from one place to another, and these things were compatible. And both of them were just very heavily influenced by 19th century thought and evolution. And that runs through, and it's still present in this very late presentation by Sahlins on the subject of kinship, because he's still seeing culture as being somehow created in a way that is developing outside our control and is specifically variable. There's a sense in which he's seeing us as mutually creating variations on how we're going to relate to each other through our kinship structure, but not fundamentally remaking it, because we are in some located, embedded, our being exists within some cultural framework that he thinks is given to us and that we're not able to choose, that it is a priori, it's simply there. And this is an emphasis on the depth of cultural difference that exists. Many ways, practically speaking, we sometimes do come up against the difficulty of changing how we ourselves think or trying to talk to somebody across a very deep cultural divide. So culture has some kind of depth, not all of which is entirely conscious. But on the other hand, in Sahlins' formulation, on the one hand, we get a really fascinating presentation of the way in which we mutually construct ourselves through our social worlds, but underlying that, he's still assuming there's something culturally beyond our control. And there is a passage towards the end of part 2 here, in which he talks about inequality, domination, and hierarchical inclusion. I guessed you here to such politics of kinship practice, but as I am rather concerned with what kinship is, I reserve these issues for other occasions. So in a sense, he's not saying you can't pay attention to it, but he doesn't think this is what's really going on with kinship. And that, I think, is one of the places where there's a limit here, or something that we want to think about. Because perhaps we can't assume that we're totally in control of what's going on. Nevertheless, I think that one of the things that can be underlined here is he's talking about people's way of being in the world and is focusing on how one culture might choose to be one way while another culture chooses to be another way. And all of this is deeply embedded in our social relations with people around us. And so far that makes perfect sense. The thing is that I think that when one actually examines kinship systems in real life, I think that's the current term we're using for this. In real life, people actually do remake their kinship relations in very interesting ways. So this is where I think that we would want to engage in some kind of, think seriously about what Sahlins is offering here, and to look at what he's saying about sociality and the way in which it is mutually constituted. But not necessarily to assume that we're entirely trapped. I think that we see people constantly remaking their social relations. So what we want to look at are some of the things he talks about how that is done, and how it is done together with other people. And this is a way of getting outside the notion of bourgeois individualism, and maybe just bourgeois individualism versus culture beyond us, and to be firmly in the area of social relations, sociality. So how do we relate to other people? Which bits of ourselves are we in fact giving to somebody else and understand to reside in somebody else? You can think of, say, parent-child relations as being one that is mutual in that sense. You're giving part of yourself, in a sense, to another person, whether or not they're biologically related, and that's not part of the argument. And you incorporate into yourself parts of the people that you really care about. I mean, it's part of really caring about somebody is that you take some part of their being into yourself. So to some extent, what he's talking about is the way in which various parts of ourself are shared with other people in this concept of the individual that he's getting out of some earlier anthropologists, Bastide, Marriott, and especially Marilyn Strathern, and talking about how we shouldn't think of ourselves as one hermetically sealed envelope of self or person, and instead to see how various parts of ourselves are located in other people, and various parts of other people are located in ourselves. And that is where everything becomes, I think, really interesting. And those are the parts that David Graeber builds upon.
I have a quick question.
Yes, I was about to pause and ask for questions, so please go ahead.
So if I understand correctly, what you said about Sahlins is that we're not choosing our culture. So it's in direct contradiction of what David was writing in the culture as creative refusal, as am I understood correctly?
Well, right, but we probably have trouble refusing everything. You know, I mean, we're also saying yes to some things as well. So culture can be creative refusal, but it can't be totally refusal.
No, but I understand that. I'm just asking, am I heard you correctly that Marshall Sahlins was thinking that we're not in control of our culture. We are not consciously choosing that. We don't have this mechanism of deciding.
Right. I was emphasizing that there's a dimension of culture that we don't get to choose because we just are born into whatever we're born into. And we get socialized into it so young that we have trouble challenging it. So, and we don't necessarily know the limits of that. I don't think he's saying we can't change anything. He's trying to say that there are parts of it that are distinct to certain societies, and you have to be born into it and grow up in it, and you may be more trapped than you recognize. And he will say you might be able to choose to be one could choose, for example, I can choose to be part of some particular community in Canadian culture, for example, or choose to be in some set of relations, but I can't choose that all of the relations in Canadian culture are going to be different. You know, so he's making distinctions between some things that are perhaps beyond my choice. I may be able to relocate myself in different relationships, but I can't necessarily change what Canadian kinship looks like. Now, I think that I would in fact challenge him in that, because I think he has a more static idea than I do, but that what he's saying is useful because it may help us to understand why it's sometimes hard to reach people across a cultural divide, because not everybody organizes their world in the same way. But I do think that if I look at something like kinship practices in Canadian society, they're incredibly fluid. We are recreating kinship in all kinds of ways that are extraordinarily different. And we can see that just in the course of single lifetimes in terms of how we're recreating what we think marriage consists of. We have, just think about new reproductive technologies and how we're thinking about kinship in that sense. And we talk openly all the time in our society about ways in which kinship is what we create, kinship is what we make, which is not taking it as the biological given it used to be. And that's a change that I could see within my lifetime. So that you're exactly right that that's, I think, what he's largely saying, except that he leaves that little space where he says that he recognizes such things happen, but it's not what he's writing this paper about. So he's leaving the window open a little bit for that. But I think we want to look through that window, I think is what I'm suggesting. Does that respond? Michael has his hand up.
Yeah, just quick, simple question. So that famous quote, "We make our own history, but not in circumstances of our own choosing." How would you relate Sahlins, Graeber, and whatever your previous guys, Leslie White, to "we make our own culture, but not in circumstances of our own choosing"? And thanks, this is really great because I see this article, but it's hard to, like, it looks like it's a lot of anthropology that I haven't read, it sounds like you kind of not need to know a lot of like the background, the previous readings to kind of really get a sense of it. So we make our own culture, but not in circumstances of our own choosing. How would you relate that? Is that relevant or?
I think we could say that. I don't think he is. David Graeber might have said something like that. And I think that it makes a lot of sense. There's a question that's being asked here about the limits of what we can do. You know, we may have more limits than we like to think we have in terms of whether we can transform things. They do seem to be more difficult. I mean, some of the theorists in anthropology who seem to have grappled with this most are people that I perceive, maybe they wouldn't, they're not living anymore, so they can't reply, but they seem to be responding to a sense in which they might like to have changed the worlds around them somewhat more, but they feel they've come up against things that they just can't change. And they're troubled by the intransigence of the difficult things in the world that they're experiencing and are taking those seriously. So there is we want to be optimistic, but to some extent, the things that we are born into and the worlds that we have to remake are not so easily remade. So that, yes, we can, I think that they're putting the weight in a less optimistic direction. And I guess I don't want to say that, except that I think that it's good to be realistic about what we're facing, and that all of this is just incredibly hard work for a very long time, but that it's also doable. We just have to recognize that it takes a lot of doing. That's my version of optimism. Yeah, so. Other people who'd like to lead in? Simona.
On one side, there's something David wrote in the introduction to the first number of How, and in other writings about what we call the great tradition of anthropology, that is what emerges when you are obliged to invent new concepts or use old words for something totally new that you as an anthropologist encounter in your on the field. Maybe this concept of kinship can be seen as one of the concepts slash words. And on the other side, I was thinking of the role of myth and imagination, of the reservoir that is our collective imagination and our imaginary relationships. It's in fragments of an anarchist anthropology, imagination looks like a reservoir and a place where we collectively elaborate our mutual creation. So yes, we are in control. We are not in control of it, but we are at the same time in control, in as much it's something we work on together. And what philosophy does, and also anthropology, at least the way Sahlins Sahlins and David did, is to delve into concepts, into our into what we give for granted, and see the implications, the complexity of these ideas. So I think there is a conscious refusal, there is a conscious ability to choose one's behavior, or even what one wants to be. And at the same time, this is possible in as much you are aware of the frames of your thought. You are aware of some pieces of what you are. And I think this awareness is something you have to conquer all the time, and that you conquer when you are faced with totally different experiences and totally different frames, where what would provoke your anger and your reaction makes totally sense. And the ability to get into this other sense is the ability of getting aware of what you are and what you are unaware of. Sorry if I was confused. It was many ideas altogether.
If I followed you correctly, I think I very much agree with that, and that it's very well put. I think that culture is a kind of complicated thing. It's unquestionably the case that we have these capacities to imagine, to create our world symbolically, to be able to express it in words, and to share intentionality. This is one of the important things Sahlins was trying to underline, that we can actually, think about our worlds and share what we think about with other people, and have it understood and responded to in mutuality. He's locating mutuality right in the way in which we conceptualize and imagine the world we live in. So that's in a sense what we're doing right now. We are sharing what we think about the world we live in, how we would think about culture or kinship, and we're trying to understand what each other shares in a mutual process. And if we were doing this at greater length, we would come out of this change somewhat through that process. So what we're doing is putting, the really positive part of this is that it seems to be intrinsic to human beings, that we are able to do this thinking, that we do it together with other people. We have mechanisms through language and through our capacity to listen to each other, which he has a part in part 2, if people get to it, where he's talking about some of the studies of infants and non-human primates that talk about the ability to understand what other people are intending as perhaps being a really defining feature of humans. And it doesn't matter if other primates can do it too, that's fine. But it's something that seems to be something that we have a capacity to do, that is really something to treasure and to understand, that how creative it is and how much it relies on being able to understand and listen to other people at the same time, so that it's something that we create together with other people. And I think that one of the things that we want to do, and this is another way of coming back to David Graeber, is where Sahlins is putting his critique of culture in terms of a critique of how the processes by which Parsons carves things up. One of the things towards an anthropological theory of value that I think is just incredibly important is the examination of fetishism. and he's talking more about the fetishism of commodities. But I think that we can look at culture as being fetishized to a very large degree. So where it's not working, where it seems to be outside us, what we have is exactly the process that Marx described in the fetishism of commodities, where you take what is really creative within human beings, you think of it as being outside people, you reify it, and then you give it all this power over human beings. So it's an exact corollary of fetishism of commodities. And I've been trying for a number of years to remove the word culture from my vocabulary, which is a bit difficult to do as a professional anthropologist. But to some extent you can do it by trying, you can substitute synonyms in some sense. But the object is, to some extent, to avoid turning these creative processes into things that stand above us. I think that is a place we can go, especially because this insight into the fetishism of commodities is just so incredibly powerful as a way in which we can critique culture. Dorothy Smith, who's a theorist I would highly recommend to everybody, has done it on what she calls textual reality. And she's applied it to Foucault and his construction of knowledge, for example, as well, as being these things that stand outside us and dominate us. And I think that the task with some of this, with what Sahlins is doing with Kinship here, is to defetishize culture and take that part of this article out and leave in it what he says about the mutuality of interpersonal relationships as being absolutely central in human life. And if we can recover that creativity and to see it as being mutual and very complexly structured within our sociality, we have more tools for thinking who we are as we rebuild the worlds we live in. And I think that it becomes then much more dynamic and open. And we can keep all of those capacities for symbolizing that Simone has been underlining without having to fetishize them. So, and that is very liberating. There's still, the fact that we probably don't agree with everybody else and we have to change ideas we grew up with ourselves. And it's all, a difficult, slow process, but we're more enabled to do it if we take David Graeber's approach. And it's unfortunate in a way that I think these articles were almost written knowing what Graeber was saying and choosing to make the art a slightly different argument. I kind of wish we'd had a sense of what Graeber would do with Kinship, but there's always more to be done. Rob has his hand up.
Yes, hi. While listening to your thoughts, I remember that Paul also wrote a book about his favorite books, and one of these writers suffered schizophrenia. And as we are talking about culture is something like being framed into, the writer healed himself through learning a second language, and in his mother tongue he always felt enormous pain from listening to his mother and to his surrounding and to his whatever. And in the second language he started to learn a third one out from the second, and in the third language he became free of his illness or his mental disease and felt free to write his book. This came up to me as a possibility to imagine that there is probably a way out of cognitive relations we are framed into, like culture is. Yeah, unfortunately, I cannot remember the writer right now, but it was impressive to me that he described the pain he felt in his mother tongue to listen and to feel what is happening, and he got free of that to learn a third language out from a second one. Yeah, that's what came up to me while listening to you. Wonderful.
That's very interesting. And I think there are probably many people on this call who speak multiple languages and have a parallel experience. I wouldn't think of saying the same things in Chinese that I think of saying in English, because one wouldn't. Yeah. So in a less dramatic sense, I think that's incredibly true. Michael?
Yeah, it sounds like a fascinating story that because you're being driven. I mean, craziness is oftentimes that you are driven crazy by other people. It's not. It might even, even if you have an organic problem in your brain, like people everybody's different. People make amends for that. So the social relations that you have are what, in some ways, what drives you crazy. Somebody else, somebody else needs to feel that they are important and their sanity is more important than somebody else's sanity, and they use something and they draw, and other people can't be thing. So it's interesting to see that social relationship is also dependent upon a cultural framework like your language, whereas the social relationship might, and the kinship relationship in terms of your family and all that. So it's a fascinating story. I'd love to hear, if you find the result of who that author was, I'd love to know. I was just going to comment to Ellen, a different remark. I know you didn't like the word culture. You're like, I'm trying to get rid of the word culture. And lots of people don't like say, oh, culture, it's bad, because we often, like certainly in English, people think culture, and the first thing they hear with the word culture is like art museum or something like these prissy kind of things, and like, that, and the idea that rich people take over culture and own it, right? That's maybe not what you're talking about. You're talking about another, like that's a very definite reification of culture, where art and pictures are like how we represent ourselves to ourselves, and the rich people take over art and make it and buy it, turn it into a commodity, and people all hate culture, right? But like on the other hand, and this is I think this is a very German use of the word culture. The Germans use culture versus civilization, and civilization is kind of how you get people is actually a bad word. It's the civilized people take over with swords and guns, and so there's a famous quote by one of the Nazis, which is, every time I hear the word culture, I reach for my gun, because they're really annoyed about culture. If you see, the culture wars now are basically people trying to stop art and culture and people talking about each other. Or Rudolf Rocker is an anarchist who escaped Nazi Germany and brought his book in just text, and he wrote the book Nationalism and Culture, and he talked about how nationalism was a bunch of people like trying to territorialize culture and say, you speak this language, you therefore have to obey this government, right? The nation and the state and a particular form of power was in charge, whereas Rudolf Rocker took the word culture and said, no, nationalism is different than culture. And, in reality, it's quite hard to say, because people's belief in a nation, is in some sense part of their culture. So Rudolf Rocker takes culture and makes it universal, which is like kind of untrue. Like culture is universal, except everybody participates and contributes to culture in their own way. And and I would wanted to argue, and nobody who's an anthropologist and the other people who are cultural studies people, and they also have a definition of culture, these different disciplines, and they never, like if you use Rudolf Rocker, no one would agree with this, but he's a particular anarchist. who who harkens to talking about the big history of this in his book Nationalism and Culture. And I was trying to argue that you have a paradigmatic comparison of nationalism and culture. So paradigmatic is you have two paradigms and you put them next to each other and they kind of thing. So like, you know how the color, if you have the color green and the color, if you have the color blue-green, so it's a bit blue and it's a bit green, it's blue-green. If you put the color blue-green next to the color green, then when you look at the color blue-green, it looks blue. But if you put the color next to the color blue-green next to the color blue, then it looks green. You know, I'm not sure if I said that way, but the other way around, right? So culture is really kind of just this big bunch of stuff. But if you put it, and nationalism in some sense is part of culture, for what people think of their thing. But if you take culture and put it next to nationalism, everything that is like that kind of territorialization of stuff, then culture looks like everything that's positive, and it's people interacting and being social and being alive. So that's what I kind of wanted to try to save the word culture by kind of comparing culture to nationalism, which is the sort of all the kind of death, I'm going to use violence and control you parts of culture, honestly, because all of that stuff is our interaction, and saying that's nationalism and culture is the other way. And I wondered how, I mean, that's kind of part of what you're saying is Sahlins has moved from this guy, Leslie White, and put sociality into culture. So I wondered if you could maybe comment a little bit about how you put sociality into culture, and does that liberate culture and give it more of we determine it by being alive and have more relationship to power over the long term, how we reproduce ourselves as culture becomes something, but it can change. Like a living culture versus a dead culture, a living culture versus what your phrase was, when culture is removed from us and it is fetishized.
I think that raises a lot of really important issues, and a lot of the things that we can talk about in terms of nationalism they also have to do with these ideas of some sort of mutual relationships. So we can sort of transpose the same kind of arguments being made about kinship into other kinds of connections in which we're mutually involved in each other. And I think that your point about how being able to see culture as being embedded in sociality and being essentially social in nature is key to all of this, because it is basically how we remake things together with other people. And it's also because doing all of these things with other people is really difficult because they don't necessarily want to do the same thing. So if we think of culture as just something where we can explore our own imagination and write something that's different, for example, that is incredibly free and liberating. But if it's going to really have an impact, it has to become part of some other people. And what we're going to be doing also has to have some part of other people involved in it for it to be real and meaningful in the world. And then it comes up against how everything has to change in terms of our relationships with other people as well. So this sociality makes culture incredibly challenging and complicated. It gives it all its potential, and it also makes it difficult to do things. Does that make sense? And all of that applies not just to kinship, but it applies to other ways in which we think of ourselves as being mutually involved in each other. And there are all kinds of efforts to construct that in terms of ethnicity or nationality or religion, some of which are enabling building community and some of which are have problems that we know about. Vasily has posted some useful resources. Do you want to say anything about them, Vasily?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring to your attention the this colloquium in the journal where you find a lot of reviews of the book. It's quite fascinating. As I was saying in the chat, almost all Sahlins' book raised a lot of debates, including that one, which is one of his latest books. Am I right, Helen?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and then I put this. I couldn't resist to put this paper on culture that he wrote. Two or three things I know about culture, which is also quite interesting. Sahlins is not easy to read, but it's as you were saying, Michael, because of all those anthropological references, you would expect, because it has been published as a book, you would expect something a bit more mainstream, but it is not at all. It is very much scientific, but still, I think it's very enjoyable to read because he's full of fight, and that's something that it's always nice to read. To read someone that is as combative as Sahlins. I think it is also one of the things that we liked in David's writings. And you're right as well about the fact that it's not easy because it doesn't give you a literature review of Kinship. It really goes through the literature that he likes reading, this kind of new kinship studies. And so you don't get a sense of, you don't really get a sense of the history of the notion in the field. But still, I think it was very, very enjoyable. Thank you so much, Helen, for suggesting this text that I haven't read before. And I was also expecting to see a little bit more about reciprocity. These 3 circles of reciprocity. This is the idea that, especially when he talks about generalized reciprocity, it seems to me that it's something that he kind of abandoned at the end of his life. Generalized reciprocity is typically the kind of thing that you would expect to find in when you talk about kinship, because it's between kins or people who or people who you would treat as if they were kins, basically. And yeah, because I thought it could have been a really obvious link with David's work. General reciprocity is very close to basic communism. Yeah. So anyway, thank you so much, Helen, for suggesting that reading.
That is a really good point to make, and I would say people shouldn't be totally put off by reading Sahlins. Some of it is very eloquent, as well written as David Graeber's, and some of it is like this. It depends on the audience that he has in mind and what he wants to do. I think the mention of going to generalized reciprocity is really important. There's and when we do that, we could take things out of these articles by Sahlins that give us tools to be more optimistic and uplifting. He evidently wasn't in that kind of space, but he wrote these articles that were already in the dark times that we're now living in. But it's that is imminent in some of his work, as well as the vigorous debate. So I think we've gone a little bit over time on this, and there's all these great readings that Vasily has posted that we can carry on with. So I think we're probably finished for now. For some of you, it's late in the evening.
But we should continue this discussion on Sahlins and and on culture, or I think it was very interesting. And Helen, if you want to co-facilitate again, you're very welcome to do so. Like actually everyone here, but it would be really interesting to do a bit more on anthropological work in the future.
And I remember in our discussions, you were talking more about working on kings. So perhaps we could, think about, perhaps getting together and doing something on the political dimensions. It's unfortunately all too timely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I would be very interested to read part of the King's books on kings, and also talk about kingship and sovereignty. Yeah, previously we were talking about the sovereignty and the idea of war. Yeah, I think it's super actual, like just perfect discussion for right now, for this moment.
Okay, that's wonderful. It leads us forward, and I'm very thankful for all the stimulation of the seminar, that it's been a privilege to be able to be part of for these months. And I look forward to our next meeting. So thanks to everyone. I think we're finished now. Is that right? Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Helen.
Bye-bye.